One of the main goals of my lab is to develop the capabilities of modeling and simulating complex musculoskeletal architectures, okay? And so the idea is that we can use these models to understand how biological organisms are designed and extract some design principles that then we can use in artificial man-made devices, okay? Whether they are fully artificial or biohybrid, combining biological components and artificial components. So in the past couple of years, we developed the capabilities to simulate all sorts of architectures. Some could be realistic, like these are the wings of a pigeon, and some can be completely man-made, okay? The method behind this relies on assemblies of Kosterrat rods, and Kosterrat rod is a model that allows you to efficiently capture the 3D dynamics of slender elements, like fibers and muscles and bones. So here is an example of this method in action. So these are the wings of a pigeon. We reconstruct them entirely based on morphological and biomechanical data. Every rachis, every barb in the feathers are modeled as rods. Bones are modeled as rods that are rigid. These ones are passive and elastics. And muscles are soft, compliant elements. And so if we take experimental measurements of EMGs and we plug them into our muscles, the muscle starts contracting, and the gait of the full structure reproduces the gait of the actual wings. So here is how it looks. The muscle contracts and bends, and the whole wing reacts accordingly, and the gait of the different joints reproduces the gaits observed in nature. Here is another view of a single wing, and then you can see we can capture the full dynamics of these systems. And we use this technology to help and speed up the design of biohybrid robots, okay? So these robots are basically made of artificial components and cells that are seated on them, and when they mature, they gain some functionality, and these robots can walk or swim and things like that. And so it's very hard to design them and fabricate them, and so if you have a way to develop everything in a computer and give the blueprint to the experimentalist, you can speed up things quite a lot. So this was a successful example in which we targeted the biggest and fastest walking biobot out there. And so we did the entire design computationally. We designed the scaffold, the materials, the geometry, the topology of the muscles, where to put them. And it walked in simulations. It walked fast enough. We gave this blueprint to the experimentalist. They ran their experiments, and experiments and simulation matched pretty well. So this whole thing took a month instead of 1 year and a half without simulation. So here is how it looks experimentally. So this is the walker. It's in a liquid, and when you shock the bath, the muscle, which is grown in vitro, contracts, and this thing walks. So this is in the case of something that walks, but we can do the same for swimmers, and so we design some swimming configurations that allow to carry some stuff on the head, and they can propel in fluids. All right, so now that we have the capabilities to design these systems, we want to use them for something. And especially biohybrid systems are interesting for biomedical applications, and because they can operate in a microfluidic environment, and you can think of them of delivering some payloads, some drugs, or carry out some sort of operations, okay? So they are characterized by some complex geometry, and what we would like to do now is to design both the geometry and the associated flow field so that we can do something useful out of it. What is interesting about these systems is that they turn out to operate in a regime which is called viscous streaming. And viscous streaming is a very niche phenomenon in fluid mechanics, for which if you have the right ratio of diameter, oscillation frequency and amplitude, and viscosity of the fluid, you can vibrate an object, and out of an unsteady motion, you can generate a steady flow field, okay? It's a second-order effect coming out straight out of the Navier-Stokes equation, and here's how it looks, and why this is nice, because you can use this steady field is robust, and you can use it for something. It splits your flow domain in different regions, so it partitions it in different regions, and you can do microfluidics in these separate regions, particle separation, and people have done that, okay? So now the idea is that can we do that with our biobots? It's a long shot, because there's so many unknowns. The first of all is that can streaming be useful for dragging along particles so the question is, because streaming is a second-order effect, it's much smaller, much weaker than just the wake effect. So can we usefully apply it in this context? And the second thing is that we know everything in the case of cylinders, we know a lot in the case of spheres, and we don't know anything else. But these geometries are not cylinders and are not spheres. So can we play with the geometry and the topology of the structure to design useful flow fields? So here, just to formalize a little bit the idea, so we can simulate these things. So this is a cylinder oscillating with a certain frequency and amplitude. This is its radius. And you can define these non-dimensional numbers, the oscillatory Reynolds number and streaming Reynolds number, and depending on these two values, you know how your field is going to look like. So if we run our simulations, this is a stream function plot, you can see that it takes a few cycles to establish, but then because the established field is steady, it doesn't change anymore, and you can see that we recover the same partition that I showed in the other image. Okay, so here, for example, you can see you have some inner layers that you can use for some things, and then larger outer layers you can use to drag in more particles. So the first question that we want to attack is, can we use viscous streaming for enhancing transport in a payload application? So the way we think about it is the following. We have a very simplified model in which we think of a biobot as a cylinder which moves, it's active and moves at a constant speed. Okay, so we call this the master. And then we have a payload, say a drag, which is also a cylinder and is passive, just reacts to the flow, okay? And so if you are in this very simple setup and you move the master, what happens is that depending on the Reynolds number of the master, you can either drag along the payload or not. So if the Reynolds number is too high, the payload stays behind, so you cannot drag it. If you reduce the Reynolds number, you can drag it along, and then the payload stays at a constant distance from the master. And if you reduce further, the Reynolds number, then you can really effectively attract the payload robustly. And so the important thing to notice is that there are two transitions here, below which you cannot trap, and in between which you can effectively trap the slave. And these transitions are sharp. Okay, so the system is inherently unstable there. And so maybe by constructing a perturbation of the flow field properly, we can allow to bend these trajectories from non-transporting to transporting down here. Okay? So here's what we do now. We add an oscillatory field to try to elicit this streaming field. Okay? And what happens is that oscillations always enhance the transport characteristics. So here, just to give you an example, this is what happens at Reynolds 90 without oscillations. So the distance of the slave keeps growing. It means it's left behind. And if we increase the oscillation intensity, you can see that we bend this curve downwards, and so we can transport this payload, while before it was not possible. And this is robust and works across all Reynolds numbers. So the first thing that we establish is that, this type of perturbation can help, okay? But is it really streaming? Because oscillations can interact with the wake in a number of ways, okay? So if we look at the stream functions, stream lines generated by the master moving without oscillation and with oscillation, we see that oscillations cause a streamline contraction, okay? Physically, that means that the uptake velocity of the wake grows, okay? And that is what helps to carry the payload along. And this mechanism is really what we see in streaming, okay? So here what we have is a cylinder which is just oscillating, so pure streaming, no motion. And as we increase the oscillation intensity, you can see this contraction of the streamline. So this is really a hallmark of the streaming. And you can see that if we plot the velocity of the flow, you have this increase which corresponds to what you see in this system. And so if streaming can actually be used, then the next question is, can we move away from a cylinder and design a better streaming field, okay? So we found this paper, which is basically the only paper that looks at something else than a cylinder. They looked at these triangles streaming, and they see these type of regions. And so this seems to be, this large recirculating region in the back seems to be quite useful for transport, because if we place our payload there, it seems like this can help to transport it. And so what we did was to take our cylinder and morph it to break the symmetry as in here, and to increase the curvature as it's done in these two corners, okay? And if you look at the pure streaming field, you see that you have a further reduction, contraction here, so higher velocity, and a different topology. And so if you, if you run the cylinder and this new design without streaming, this is what you obtain, but when you turn on streaming, this more favorable streaming field allows you to bring the payload. And the next thing is topology, okay? So this is a whole open question. We don't know what happens when you change the topology of your flow. So if you run 3D simulations of streaming field, you can get different structures. It's very hard to understand what is happening. So the first thing that we need to do is to try to compress all this in something that we can understand. So if we track critical points in the flow in 3D, we can reconstruct the flow skeleton and tell something about what happens when topology changes. So if we have a sphere and we oscillate it and we take different slices of the flow field and we track the critical points across these slices, we can reconstruct the topology, the skeleton of the streaming field. And so here is how it looks. In the case of a cylinder, these are focus line and these are saddle lines, and that's a compact way to capture its skeleton. And if you go into genus 1 topology, like a torus, here is what you do. So you start creating these slices in the field. And so if we track rotating along one axis, the focus and saddles, we start painting the skeleton of the torus. And so we can do this across different axes. So here is around the y-axis, and keep painting the skeleton, and then we can finish with the third axis and rotate it this way, and so we can track the remaining points. And so if you do that, here is what you see. And as soon as you change the topology, your flow topology completely explodes and changes. And within, whenever, even if you change the geometry of the torus, but the topology is the same, you can change, the geometry of these lines, but their topology remains the same, okay? And so now here where we are, we have the capability to design streaming geometries, to play with geometry, to play with topology, and the next step is to understand how we can use this usefully in biohybrid applications. And these are my students who are doing all the work. And thanks to you for the attention.